Before 1947, or in 1947 when India was partitioned, in 1947 India became free. So freedom was granted by the British on one condition, that India would be divided into India and Pakistan. Okay? So the map of India which you see now, that is India. And what you see as Pakistan and what you see as Bangladesh together was formed, together was united into one country.
Today's Friday. After that, yeah, Sunday is Sunday. So you have to wait until Monday. So they asked me if you they can exchange money for you now. 一会他就会有规定一定要换多少钱，因为他想把他的美金换成台币，你要拿到多少钱？因为我不知道为什么。约在外面，约在外面。我就卖就东西。他万一摆上他顶盖就是什么？对，不知道我问看。
Am I supposed to get I got my coffee, but I haven't drank it yet.
Hey, good afternoon. How's everybody? How's everybody? All right. Okay. First of all, my name is Andy Won. I'm supposedly co-teaching this session with Ashish. Very happy and excited, and also nervous about being here. You know, there's so many of you, and it's like in a movie theater, you know, and I'm nowhere close to a star or anything. In any case, let me quickly introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Andy Won. I work in Academia Sinica in the Institute of European and American Studies, which supposedly is not Interior Cultural Studies, but that was my other hat, right? My other professional life. My research work is mostly in the field of Asian American history and literature, with a particular focus on student migration, so the culture and history of student migration to the United States. That's my previous life and also earlier projects. I'm very happy and excited to be part of this Summer Institute, summer school program, especially to be talking about Gandhi, Tagore in relation to what Ashish just presented. And before I go into, I want to make two quick announcements. There are two other faculty actually in the room right now. Professor Amy Perry over there, and Professor Din Fei over there, and Hans that you have met yesterday. I was told to make this quick announcement so that students know who is in the room and can approach them afterwards for chat or whatnot. Okay, so I want to also apologize for not making enough handouts. I thought there were only 40-some students in a program, but it turns out to be something like 40, 60-something. So that's totally to my surprise. So I made only 50 copies, and if you don't have one, please kindly share it. Not that it's all that special, and if you really want it, I can make a copy for you later on. But just, in the case that you may need it right now, please share with your neighbors. So the presentation that she just gave us give a pretty nice sense about Tagore and the kind of debate that Tagore has with Gandhi. And some of that we'll be going to later on with more detail to the text. But I think I just want to quickly say that two problematics comes forward for me. One is the question about modernity. How did India experience modernity? What kind of modernity that is, right? And how do we kind of think about that in relation to the British colonialism, particularly with the tragedy of partition in 1947. So how does modern come to be experienced in particular? And another one is the idea of India. I don't know how many of you have been to India or from India, but for me, I've only been to India once. And the place I went to is called Hyderabad. Hyderabad. Is that the right pronunciation? And it's somewhere in the middle of India. And for a Taiwanese to go to India, surprisingly, you need to get a visa. And in order to get the visa, I had to go to the Indian consulate here in Taipei 3 times. Because they rejected my application for the first time, saying that we don't know that you're going to India. We don't know the conference that you're going to, and therefore we cannot grant you a visa. So I have to go back and call, and email my sponsor in Hyderabad, saying that, can you give me some, not only just the papers that I have to bring to the concert, but also over there in India, I have to contact the local agencies about, the event. So the second time I went, and they said, yeah, we finally got some information, but you have to wait. Come back in 7 days. So in other words, the road to India is long and winding, if I could put it this way. And just another thing, I thought it would be relevant, so let me just give you this story about my arrival in India. So I went to Hyderabad through Singapore. So I have to fly to Singapore first, and then get on a late night flight to Hyderabad. And I thought I was playing smart because I was sitting on a flight next to 2 Indian technicians who were working in Singapore. And I was trying to, understand, I was trying to talk to them and then to be friendly with them so that I can get some local information, right? Because we heard about the taxi fare being uneven and all that. So I suggested to the person next to me and said, can I take a taxi with you once we, land? He said, oh yeah, no problem, we'll be fine, I'll get you to where you are, you're supposed to be. So I got on the taxi with him, which took me way longer than I was supposed to be, because he has to get all the things from the customs. And so it took him about like an hour before we can actually get on the taxi. And the more interesting thing comes after we got on the taxi, because I have no way to know where he is actually going. So he's the only person who can talk to the Indian driver. And he said, I'm actually getting off first, but I'll make sure that the driver will take you to your hotel. And so the smart me, thinking, gosh, how am I going to survive? And it was, by the time we got on taxi, it was like midnight, 12. So my friend finally got off the taxi in the nice neighborhood, which is pretty much dark to me. And then the taxi driver drove me back to the main thoroughfare, where we finally found the hotel. And I got off the taxi, withheld my money in my pocket, because I realized the door of the hotel is closed. It was like shut down. And so what am I supposed to do? So of course, I finally made my way into the hotel. Without actually being able to communicate with the people. And the reason why I give you this long story is because that I thought people in India speak English. And they do, but not in an accent that is readily acceptable to me, or understandable to me, okay? And this is not a criticism, this is only trying to say it is difficult for anyone who is not from that region to enter that particular cultural and linguistic context, especially in places like Hyderabad, which they have a local dialect of Telugu, and they have a particular identity policy attached to that language as well, which, later on for me to realize is that there are way more languages spoken in India than in Taiwan. We thought Taiwan to be multilingual in many ways, but India's got more of that. So all this is to say that, you know, in order to understand or go into India, I mean, in a kind of intellectual sense, that requires a lot of preparation. And so what I'm presenting here today is as much like you as students who don't really know that much about India, but trying to make sense of it, trying to make sense of what Gandhi offers. So two more concepts that I want to offer before I get into the main theme. One is that one of the other projects I'm working on now is on this Indian revolutionary person who was fairly well known in the Asian American context as one of the immigrant fighter and also a political scientist of Asian descent. His name is Terence Das, and I hesitated in pronunciation because Nishan corrected me a number of times the other day, and I still couldn't get it right. Okay, so it's actually written in the first item of your handout. Okay, and he's important because he was, to me anyhow, because he was thinking about independence in the Asian context. So what he was calling for is that not so much Indian independence per se, but the independence of Asia, in which India will play a huge role and part. And then through reading part of Das' work, that made me realize that it's much more complicated what's happening in India than what I perceive from the outside. So that led me to read a little bit of Gandhi, and then Hind Swaraj is, of course, one of the key texts here. Another context I want to mention is how much Gandhi's work has been taken up, you know, both consciously and unconsciously in a lot of the civil rights, well, not civil rights so much, but in a lot of the social movements lately that's happening, for example, in Taiwan and elsewhere. For example, in March 18th this year, the students went on protest in Taipei, occupying the streets. And one of the things that sort of justified what they were doing is the whole idea of civil disobedience. And that goes back to a lot of the Gandhian thinking into the non-violence, non-cooperation. And so in other words, one of the ways I'm trying to think about Gandhi is to think about how his thought or practices of non-violence and what he calls passive resistance, so to speak, can resonate in the kind of social movement context that maybe a lot of us are more familiar with. Okay. Does that make sense so far for everyone? Yeah? Okay. So I think on the one hand, I want to think about, you know, what Ashish has offered us in terms of nation, modernity, and independence. On the other hand, I want to think about what's happening on the ground. When people go into social protests, how do they think about Gandhi and how Gandhi can help them in that sense? So some of the questions that I've been thinking, for example, resistance. We tend to think about resistance as active, right? We resist something. Although we were the one who was imposed upon something, but the act of resistance can be very active in many ways. But Gandhi thinking tends to emphasize passive resistance. So how would that mean? What does that mean and how is that possible? Another question that I had in mind before coming into here is independence. We think a lot of, especially when you think about the national context, right? The typical post-colonial model is that national liberation is achieved, then independence is guaranteed. But we often tend to, you know, this model often tends to overlook a lot of the interdependencies that happens both before and afterwards. For instance, in the realm of economy, how does an independent nationhood work with its former colonial master? In terms of the regional sort of situation, how an independent country is really independent in its own way. And this, of course, you know, for those of you who are in Taiwan will probably know what I'm saying. Taiwan being an quote-unquote independent country would have a lot of dependencies or interdependencies that need to be worked out. And of course, another one would be how do we think about modernity, especially in this kind of colonial underpinning. And I'll quickly just go to the fourth one, which I think is also very important. And one of the things that I really think a lot about before coming here That is, in other words, if we're not reading Gandhi merely in the Indian context as some kind of Indian philosopher, politician, strategist, if you will, but also in an inter-Asian context, meaning the value of Gandhi would not merely be understood as Indian, but also as this kind of possible reference point. So, for example, how would Gandhi work in relation with Mao? Do they articulate different kind of strategies? Or are there places where certain similarities can be emphasized? How would Gandhi's discussion about modernity, for instance, help us understand Takeuchi Yoshimi, which I think you guys will be reading in the later weeks, about overcoming modernity, about, for example, Takeuchi's idea of resistance, how would that be relevant to Gandhi's? Likewise, the context of division in India, how would that be relevant to, for example, the context of division in North Korea, between South and North Korea, or between Taiwan and mainland China, so on and so forth. So I want to kind of open it up so that you're not just jumping into one big chunk, as I was thinking about jumping into one big chunk of, deep philosophy and difficult foreign words, but also something to sort of bring you back to your, to where you are, to your actual experiences. So is that all right? Okay. And before we go into the text itself, I thought there would be some important context to bring out, to kind of put on the floor. And this is a little bit of presumptuous of me in thinking that you probably don't know about this, because I didn't know before I got into this text. So these are a few contexts that I thought would be interesting and important. Some of them are very, Wikipedia-like, as you can see. I say that in the quotation, right? So it's from Wikipedia. But as primitive as that is, I think it's still important to have it in your hand. So I'll quickly say a few things about the partition of Bengal, and which, obviously is linked to the Swadeshi movement. And I think if time permits, Ashish can really help us to get into the details of that. But what I want to say first is that India was one. As we imagine nations in many ways. India was one, right? And the boundaries was once clear and not so clear. And a lot of the kind of national feeling happened precisely when the oneness gets affected. Right? And this is the significance of 1905, the British plan to partition Bengal away from India proper, so to speak. And so if you read the text, you will see a little bit of how that happened. Lord Curzon was the person who was responsible for that. And its implication in the rise of the Bengali sentiment and the nationalism. And out of this partition, this 1905 partition context, came the Swadeshi movement, which is people-run the sort of precursor of the independence movement, so to speak, which Tagore at one point was involved in, but later on opted out, or took a different line from that. And that sort of bring the India sort of, well, at least this is from what I read, brought the sort of oneness of India more prominently in relation to the British. The Salt text, which probably doesn't require a lot more explanation, simply because if you have seen Gandhi in a film, there's one really important, interesting film of Gandhi, and the Salt text, especially his his walk to the ocean side to make salt as a form of social demonstration, really heightened the importance of the Salt text as a form or a sign of oppression. So the actual act of making salt by your own hand, very much like the chakra, which I have in the handout later on. I'll get back to that first image in a minute. Has a lot to do with this idea of the self-reliance, right? So we can actually survive on our own terms. And if we can make salt on by ourselves, we can, we can try to run the government by ourselves. And therefore, the kind of modernity, the kind of nation that we imagine doesn't have to be dictated by the colonial masters. And another context that I want to offer, which is the fourth one, is the Indian National Congress, which again is like, why would I put this over here? This is like ABC to many of you, perhaps. But if you read Hin Swa Ra, in the very beginning of the text, is the dialogue between the editor and the reader. And the discussion is actually about how important is the Indian National Congress and the kind of approach they were taking. So I read it both in the sense of the generational gap, or actually rather the kind of strategic, the differences between strategic lines. For instance, the younger generation tend to be more revolutionary, want to take it up arms. And these people, including the ones that I studied, Treknas Das, belong to this overseas revolutionary party called the Gardar. They were the more sort of, how would I put it, the more militant in the 1920s. And Gandhi represents this other dimension where you want to have a party to work within the system and actually be the organ for the people to resist the government, which is the British. A few more details here. For example, one of the earliest ideas for Gandhi and the Indian National Congress is not so much for proper independence, but rather to get some kind of status as Canada. And that opens up a whole different dimension for me in thinking about what independence can mean. How would how would become like Canada be a good option at a time, for example, and how would that become so unimaginable for people like me at this very moment? And likewise, for example, if people know about Okinawa, the kind of political arrangement and structure and geopolitical context, how would that offer different ways of thinking about independence? In other words, and also the role of the party, right? Nowadays, people in Taiwan, especially the younger generation, have no faith in the party whatsoever. The party doesn't lead the people in one way or another. The party is, basically a politician slum, a slum of politicians who are running away from us. But yet, party remains to be very important organs of political making, in making policies, debating politics. So how do we think about the party? How do we think about these, organs when we don't really have one? So these are some of the contexts which may not be all that new to those of you, I guess. But nonetheless, I think it will help us to have a few, bricks, blocks of bricks for getting into the text itself. And before I get into the text itself, I want to invite you all to go back to the very first image, the very image that I have over here. How do you read this image? Gandhi sitting there with a wheel spinning on the side. This is, I don't know, I think this will probably be one of the canonical images of Gandhi, right? Something that we're actually more familiar than unfamiliar. But how do we make sense of an image like this? And why the image of Gandhi is so wedded to this particular form or atmosphere or image making? What that tells us about India, in other words, and what that tells us about Gandhi. Anybody, any thought about this image? Anything that jumps to your mind that you want to say first?
Self-reliance.
Self-reliance. You're spinning your own wheel. Yeah, that's right. What else besides self-reliance? Okay, the enrichment of the inner spirituality. That's deep. Anything else? Yes, please.
A simple life.
A simple life. Okay. Tim, please. The image of Gandhi is always vulnerability and poverty.
This image of him sitting,
Mm-hmm.
I'm leaving out the rest of it, but just the image of Gandhi has always been very vulnerable image and also very poor.
Okay, great, thanks. So, Tim was saying that the image of Gandhi, take away the will, just look at the person itself. It's always an image of poverty and vulnerability. Any other thought? Okay, two more hands, so we'll have the gentleman here first, and then over there.
Passive resistance. Passive resistance.
Passive resistance. Okay, and yours?
I think it's the fact that he's alone and solitary is important.
I'm sorry.
He's alone.
He's alone.
He seems solitary.
Solitary, okay. Okay.
I think this image or image, black and white image, very similar was used in the Apple campaign.
Think different.
Yeah, it was used by Apple.
Okay. That's wonderful. He was saying that it reminds him or seems to him like an Apple campaign to think differently. As a matter of fact, just not that long ago, I think just yesterday or the day before yesterday, people posting an image of Gandhi saying that, oh gosh, what was the title of that? 7 virtues that we need to keep in mind. So something like, I don't know, science without humanity, or humanities without science. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that his image is very commonly utilized for other purposes. And for this one particularly, I think all of the answers were really helpful. But I particularly want to emphasize the word of spirituality, right, and simplicity, as precisely the counterpart to what we know to be modernity, which is also something that he has discussed in his Swarai about, for example, the doctors and the lawyers. And how could those people be, not helpful? So spirituality, simplicity on one hand, poverty, vulnerability on the other, right? So in the sense that what you're seeing here is a very iconic image of him and his philosophy to begin with. As someone who is able to suffer, yet suffer peacefully. And this suffering, or suffer is probably too strong a word for this image, but the idea of one's suffering can be a powerful weapon, can be a strong form of resistance, really that vulnerability is what the kind of image messages this image is trying to entail in the larger context of the Gandhian philosophy and whatnot. Okay, so I want us to kind of keep these two in balance, because this is oftentimes the kind of contradictions that we have, right, in thinking about modernity and progress, in thinking about railroad, right? Gandhi is one of the few people, as Ashish was saying, is a cinemaphobe. He doesn't like cinema. And for another thing, he doesn't like railroad either. But so I wonder if you would like the jet plane any better, flying on economy class. But what I'm trying to say is that technology is an important element in Gandhi thinking, whether his attitude towards it is a positive one or a negative one. And precisely because technology is equated with modernity. But very interestingly, if you were like me, who is really bad at math and anything that is technical, I look at this will to be nothing more than, to be anything less than simple. It's not simple at all. You know, the art of willing it to put it in place and, you know, just simple needlework is, for me, is like almost impossible, right? So, in other words, I think there's a different level of technicality that's implied in this other form of economy or life. And how do we make sense of that? To bring this a little bit, you know, spin it, to give this a little bit other spin, is to think about the internet, for example. Right? How the internet can be a way of connecting people, as the railroad is, and how is, for example, a low-tech like this, a piece of paper, be a kind of resistance to those kind of overflow of information. Which one do we prefer? Which one can actually help us to engage with the social as we are participating in social movements of any kind? So, very quickly, okay, I should also explain. What I'm going to do now is to offer a few points about the text, and then we'll break into small sessions afterwards, so roughly around 3:35, 40-ish, and then we'll have a few questions prepared for all of you. So, you know, and I think you guys all divided into different small groups, right? So you could also talk about the questions there. But let me give you a few pointers here that I find particularly interesting and useful to me. So, for example, the use of the INC, the Indian National Congress, and the debates over strategies for self-rule. So consider this quotation. We who seek justice will have to do justice to others. Okay. This is very simple and, you know, very philosophical sense. You know, in a very philosophical sense, both easy to understand and not easy to understand. We who seek justice will also have to do justice to others. It seems very simple, right? I mean, sure, why not? This is what we're asking for. So, you know, we got to do it. But at the same time, if you understand anti-colonialism as a form of struggle, then the kind of justice you're getting, how can you repay the same justice to others? The same way, for example, in a more easy, you know, using the easier context for me, would be the Taiwanese, you know, the Taiwanese relations to the KMT, for example. People here in Taiwan, you know, going through the so-called White Terror period has been talking about transitional justice. We have gone into a different phase of, you know, politics, and we need to redress the wrongs, as well as seeking other means to maintain justice. But in what ways is justice equal to everyone? Right? This is one of the things that Gandhi doesn't really spell it out for us, but it does offer a pointer for further thinking. And I think this is, you know, to give more credit to the context would be his debate between, you know, himself and the young Indians. And I'm not referring to the journal itself, but the younger generation of Indians who wanted more revolutionary tactics. Right? And that requires violence. And for Gandhi, this is a big no-no. Violence is a form of weakness. Right? So we also need to kind of think about justice in those terms as well. Justice not only as a kind of abstract idea, but also how it can be actualized in relation to physical violence and other forms of resistance. The second one, of course, very centrally is this idea of the Swarai. You know, pardon my pronunciation one more time. And this is the quotation. He says, we want English rule without the Englishman. You want the tiger's nature, but not the tigers. Strength lies in absence of fear, not in the quantity of flesh and muscle we may have on our bodies. Moreover, I must remind you who desire home rule that after all, the Bills, the Pinaris, the Assamese, and the Thugs are our own countrymen. To conquer them is your and my work. So long as we fear our own brethren, we are unfit to reach the goal. And the reason why I put this out here is not just because of that theme about violence that we touched on earlier, but to understand the people that you are fighting for and with are not necessarily the people that you like. Oftentimes we're fighting alone for a goal that includes, in many ways, the people who are next to us who happen not to be the people that we enjoy having a company with. And I think that gives a really more difficult spin to all these other struggles that we're witnessing, for example, in Taiwan or in Hong Kong nowadays. The tendency to demonize the other, right? The tendency to, declare our righteousness in a form of, or in the name of justice, and the sort of simple segue to some other form of violence becomes, in some sense, very common. And how does Gandhi help us to be attentive to these other forms of violences and still work with, our weakness forward? Definition of civilization. That's another big one that relates to the question of modernity early on. And here it's a very simple one. He said, civilization is that mode of conduct which points out to man the path of duty. Performance of duty and observance of morality are convertible terms. To observe morality is to attain mastery over our mind and our passions. So doing, we know ourselves. The Gujarati equivalent for civilization means good conduct. While this definition doesn't seem to surprise us too much, the counterpart that he has actually in the text just a few pages earlier, where he says, the Western civilization is civilization only by men. And this again, goes back to his debate with the reader, quote unquote, the reader, about what kind of modernity is desirable. And this is also where I will start to think about the Gandhian philosophy of passive resistance in relation to, for example, something Guanxing would say, de-imperialization, right? So in a certain sense, we can see Gandhi's approach to home rule is not to get away the British only. It's not about kicking the others out, but to kick the demon within ourselves, which has been educated by this other foreign power. And so the work is not only done in a very kind of political, social level, but in a very spiritual level, intellectual level, right? And this is the hardest part, where you need to resist your tendency to be just like the enemy that you want to get rid of. And therefore, the definition of good conduct becomes an interesting one. The next one, religious conflict and India as one nation undivided. And this goes back to this other question that we raised earlier about the nation. He says, but just as I respect a cow, so do I respect my fellow man. This is in the context of the domestic, the ethnic conflict between the Mohammedans, the Muslims, and the Hindus. The cow become a really crucial symbol of debate. Whether we should kill the cow or not becomes oftentimes the reason why a conflict can happen. And so the Muslims who eat cows, if I get that right, that's right, they don't eat pork, they eat cows, would say, of course you can eat cow, but for Hindus, this is not something you can do. So Gandhi offers a really interesting twist here. He says, just as I respect a cow, so do I respect my fellow man. A man is just as useful as a cow, no matter whether he be a Mohammedan or a Hindu. Am I then to fight with or kill a Mohammedan in order to save a cow? This is very dialogical, but also very, very clever debate, right? Which is more important. But I think the implication is way deeper about religious difference and how do we live with religious difference, right? How, especially in the Indian context where you have all these different languages and religious practices, and that links to the very fundamental trauma of India, right? Which is the partition of Bangladesh from India, and the kind of insidious debate leading to the independence itself about setting up a different country, for example, Pakistan. That's another one for India to consider. So finally, passive resistance. This is his definition. He says, passive resistance is a method of securing rights by personal suffering. It is the reverse of resistance by arms. When I refuse to do a thing that is repugnant to my conscience, I use soul force. It involves sacrifice of self. For those of you who have read Ru Xun's "阿Q 正传", this may sound like "阿Q" a little bit, right? That we will win by soul power. If we declare victory in our mind, we are winning. But this is not exactly. This, of course, is my correction of this, right? This is not what Gandhi was trying to say. The more important argument to me is it involves sacrifice of self, right? In other words, to put yourself on the line for what you believe, rather than to take the same means as your enemy is doing to you. The greatest resistance lies not in fighting your enemy, but lies in not becoming like your enemy. This is what I take it from him. So this, has much to do with the spirituality that is upholding, and I'll, leave that for you for further discussion. And this last point is a lot more complicated, but it comes in the reading as well, which is the piece written by Ashish Nandi on the assassination of Gandhi. I don't think I have the power and ability to really represent his argument, but one thing that struck me is his observation of Gandhi's, should I use the word transgender, transsexual, or how would I put it? His unique combination of different gender consciousness. I think this is probably a better way to put it. His combination of gender consciousness, which comes in his practice of this passive resistance in one form. So in other words, passive resistance, while can be seen as a more feminine and therefore weak form of resistance, he is actually giving a masculine spin to it, to say this is actually harder than you think it is. Likewise, he's trying to say, all these kind of masculine militant maneuvers seems to be very masculine on the outside, actually, derives from a particular weakness, vulnerability within, right? So which kind of masculinity are you choosing? And so Nandi has a really interesting sort of capture of his politics, his sexual gender politics here. And I'll just read the middle part. He says, Gandhi was trying to fight colonialism by fighting the psychological equation which a patriarchy makes between masculinity and aggressive social dominance, and between femininity and subjugation. Nandi in that article goes further than this simple statement by talking about Gandhi's relationship with his father and his relationship with the mother. And this you can see a lot more clearer in his autobiography, where he talks about getting married early on and his relationship with the family. Further on, he says, to fight this battle, he ingeniously combined aspects of folk Hinduism and resisted elements of Christianity to mark out a new domain of public intervention. Gandhi not only wanted to be a transsexual Mahatma or saint in the Indian sense, he also wanted to be a bride of Christ, a Saint Francis of Assisi in the Christian sense. His goal was to become an alter ego for his potency-seeking rulers and to align with their super-ego too. And this is very, very, to me, very enlightening to see. He wants to become the alter ego for his potency-seeking rulers, right? So the other one. So if you imagine, the white angel and the dark angel, Gandhi wants to be the white angel, right? To say, don't go that direction, right? And so he says, honor, he asserted, universally lay with the victims, not the aggressors. And I think that kind of sums up, what I understand to be Gandhi's philosophy. That is, is not only a place where you stand with the victims, but also the kind of politics of victimhood that can be articulated for progressive political ends. So this is what I have for this, quick introduction to the text. I don't know if that makes sense for people here. Is this driving you nuts? I hope not. So in any case, I prepared 6 questions, which I hope will be useful and helpful for you to tackle in your group time. So I'll just quickly read them, and you can improvise if you think of other questions. You can add or revise the questions that I have here. And after that, I think we'll come back for some kind of group presentation, and Ashish can also handle a lot, and myself too, can also do some more Q&A if that helps. Okay, so let me quickly give you these questions. These are really, simple and grand questions in some ways. So the first one, what do you walk away from reading Gandhi? Can we apply the theory of peace and resistance to thinking about social movements of late? This I probably touched on a little bit earlier. Second one, how do we reflect his critique of modern civilization, such as the railway, in light of globalization today? Does they still ring true when it comes to the internet and other modern technology like the cell phone? Number 3, how do we think about ethnic, religious, cultural differences and national unity in the post-colonial moment? Is Gandhian explanation of the Muslim-Hindu conflict persuasive to you? That reference to the cow. Is that a useful, rhetoric for you? Did that convince you? Is this some kind of multiculturalism that we're familiar with? Right? Or is it a different kind of multiculturalism that we haven't really thought much about? Number 4, what do we think about Gandhi's definition of civilization as conduct and morality? Does the emphasis on the spiritual soul power make sense to you in thinking about such terms of overcoming modernity or derealization? Number 5, do you agree with Gandhi's discussion of Gandhi's transsexual critique of Indian society and British rule, and how do you think about sexuality and gender in terms of post-colonial and national psychology? And finally, which is probably the more provocative and controversial question, what is the true meaning of Swarai? Is it the same as national independence? How to think about Swarai in Korea, Okinawa, and Hong Kong in the interwoven context histories of annexation, division, and reunification. So I quickly just run through them because I don't want to dwell too much on what I've said. But just in case any questions that come up right now that you need to be responded. Yes.
I think our Indonesia context translation is quite important. So when I read your note, I'm wondering how will you translate the term in Chinese? For example, Swaraj, passive resistance, even the civilization in the Gandhian meaning. So then how will you translate this term in Chinese, and what will it mean in Chinese, and how to translate the term and keep the original meaning? And another important word in Gandhi's thought is also nonviolence. Then, I think in Hindi it's ahimsa. So maybe Ashish can also join this discussion, like how to translate this term in, like maybe not in nonviolence in Chinese, 非暴力, because ahimsa is something like non-aggressor. So if we translate as 不强势 or 不争取, what will it happen? Will it be more close to Gandhian meaning, or will it create new political meaning in our context? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think everybody heard her, right? Man, this is difficult. I don't have a ready answer for this, but maybe I just want to chime in.
No, I think these are important questions, and I think that especially because these texts now are circulating across Asia, so I know that translation has been a very, very important political issue which really needs discussion. So how these terms work is something we must discuss. But there is one real caveat here, which is a very specific Gandhian intervention. which is that the translation happens not in language, but the translation happens in action. You know? So you have to show me ahimsa, not tell me what it means in Chinese. You know, it's a really interesting location, if you like, of the problem. And this becomes an extremely important one. I mean, I just want to continue, for example, the Hong Kong situation as it is happening right now, because we actually are having a real live instance of something that Gandhi would have had a lot to say too. And I must give you a little anecdote here, which I think was important. Last year, I mean, Hong Kong friends will know this. Maybe sometime around September, there was this extraordinary protest about this television channel. Everybody knows this? Sorry? Okay. Basically, what happened was that sometime around, I think it must have been October of last year, I spent some of the semester in Lingnan University, and something very strange happened from my point of view, which is that a private television channel was not given a license. All right, I mean, I can imagine that in India, a private television channel not being given a license was something people get annoyed about. People are genuinely annoyed, so I said, okay, this is kind of serious. People are actually concerned, you know, more than merely saying, well, you know, we're sorry about this. And then a faculty member at Lingnan, Lisa Liu, she said to me that I'm taking part in a protest, and why don't you come along? So I said, sure, I'll come to a protest. And so I went along with her to the protest, and we met at, I think, Causeway Bay. We came out to the protest, and there were a small number of people. I kind of looked around me, and it looked like there were 200 or 300 people there, and I said, you know, that's a good protest. I mean, you know, like 200 or 300 people on a Sunday afternoon coming in and protesting. And this is, I mean, I'm surprised. And so we started walking down from that Causeway Bay towards Admiralty and, you know, the Lenco kind of thing. And we started walking and walking and walking, and we realized that the entire half of the road had been shut off. And we said, look, there's a lot of road shut off for 200 or 300 people. I looked around and I said, well, actually there may be 2,000 or 3,000 people. So we went there, and Lisa said, how many do you think there are? And we went to the top and you know, looked around, and I said, it was as far as I could see. So I said, looks like 20,000 people there, not 2,000 or 3,000 people there. She said, I think it's more like 50. And so it went on, right? We went inside, and there was this whole situation that arose. And then came a set of problems. See, my first problem was, why on earth would somebody want to give up their Sunday afternoon for a private television channel? I mean, you know, what's the point? How does this work? Okay. This was confusing to me. How is this a political issue in the light of what Hong Kong's politics is was even more confusing to me. How the hell does this make sense? I couldn't understand. Okay? And then came another problem, which I think was the interesting problem, the Gandhian twist, you might say, to it. And that was, people started wondering as to whether the government was going to back off and give this television channel its license or not. Okay, this was where the issue rested, right? The government did not back off, the television channel did not get its license, and a lot of the students then said, well, the protest added up to nothing. It was a failure as a protest. Which was where the problem now became a Gandhian problem. And when I was talking to some of these students, I said, what would Gandhi have said to this particular protest? Was it a failure because this channel did not get its license? Precisely not. Gandhi would have said, you have protested and you have therefore learned how to protest. Okay? It was a complete and absolute success for a Gandhian point of view because you learned how it is done. You know, the next time you protest, you will protest better. You know, this is a really, really important structure of action, if you like, that now makes a certain kind of sense. And of course, in hindsight, you know, when you start looking at the series of protests that then emerge, you will get a sense of what the history of those actions themselves were. Gandhi's further, just one other point in relation to the translation question was that he would absolutely not, I mean, the point is he was a very opinionated man, as you know, as you can make out by now. He has an opinion on everything under the sun, and the reason for why he is happily able to express an opinion, and the reason for why he is also able to be so self-contradictory is because he is not trying to persuade you towards his point of view. Okay, this is crucial. Okay, he's telling you what he thinks. You can think what you like. If the circumstances so arise that our common experience, such as if we were to work on spinning the wheel for an hour every morning, bring us to a point of view where we can start recognizing and agreeing with what we're doing, then we will probably arrive at a certain common language which will arise from a common experience, which common experience can then be politicized by me through my example of going on Sunday afternoon to protest. It means that my friends might join me later if the circumstances so arise. So that's a really interesting kind of a shift between word and action that actually I think seems to say something to the translation question as well. And I think this might be an iteration issue also.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Can you speak a bit more about colonial modernity?
Colonial modernity. Okay. What I have done is I have a bunch of texts actually on this in Communist Swaraj. But let me just very quickly say there's this one thing which is that a lot of Indian intellectuals at that point of time, Ananda Kumaraswamy, for example, in the first decade of the 20th century, were basically trying to say that it is in England's interest that it leaves India. That England is a great civilization and it is the greatness of its own history that it is belying in the process of colonizing. Okay? That's broadly speaking one situation. So you're actually awakening the British and generally speaking the Europeans to their own conscience in the process of recognizing your situation. This is a very interesting sort of take that he seems to have. Now, why has Europe lost its way? What has happened to Europe that it has gone in this extraordinary sort of direction? It is, Gandhi suggests, and I'm putting it very, very briefly, it's quite a complicated thing, partly because the terminology is, that's where language becomes important. Akil Bilgrami says that Gandhi is simply wrong when he puts it to science. It's not science that he's talking about. He uses the word science a lot. This particular form of modernity that has taken to modern science has reduced nature into something to be exploited. Okay? Nature is not something that constitutes a resource or an environment within which human beings can flourish, but actually sets you in an alienated relationship, or as he will say, a disenchanted relationship with nature. So nature is something that you will only plunder, and science helps you to plunder nature. Okay? So all forms of modernity that are structured within that form of scientific, instrumentalized, mechanized, industrial sort of production will lead to the kinds of deviations that science has created, of which, of course, the most extreme deviation was something like the atom bomb, or those kinds of extraordinarily destructive wars that structure would unleash inevitably. Right? So that would be, so that we've slightly lost our links with that structure. I mean, it's a romantic position, and Gandhi, Tagore, of course, has a position that's equally romantic, except that they would disagree on the specific modernity question. And this is in brief.
I'll just quickly chime in by saying two things, well, one is that, in a sense, translation in an inter-Asian context is very, as I totally agree with you, it's very important and difficult, right? So one of the things I want to ask you right away after you said it is to say, how do you translate 不羁? When you are trying to complicate the meaning of it, you already created another layer of complication to it. And I think this is a very essential inter-Asian exercise, that we're not simply trying to get at the perfect translation of one idea, but in a kind of very Benjaminian sense, to derive this afterlife, right? To enrich the original in that sense. So I totally welcome and applaud those who do translation, continue to do translation, and not to be not to be daunted by its imperfection, because imperfection is part of how we learn to become better. Another point about colonial modernity is that I think there's a very key question about Gandhian thinking, and that is why I put chakra, the spinning wheel, at the center of that handout. I would argue that too is technology, right? Even though that is not a colonial one. It wasn't given by the colonial master. So how do we complicate the technique of civilization, or whatever you call it? In other words, well, this is very difficult to translate, but in a way it's like saying alternative modernity. Is this alternative form going to be better, right? And part of that is really what Gandhi was trying to, persuade his readers to do. That is, we do our subsistence economy rather than this kind of large-scale capitalist development, right? And this is the time where this thinking is actually deserves some, attention, because agricultural, agribusiness is really, messing up with our life and body in many ways. But at the same time, do we have spaces for such subsistence economy to happen, right? When we are going on our protest on whatever agenda we're hitting on, what is the structural formation of our problematics, which oftentimes leads to whether we have the space for these other alternatives or not. So I don't know if that answers the question partly, but I wonder maybe we should just move into the breakout session, or
My understanding, Gandhi emphasized on the India as one nation on the basis of faculty of assimilation in the diverse India tradition. So I think in some way his concept of nation is more like modern nation sovereignty. And the other thing is that he highlights the faculty of the assimilation. It's more like Skinner's theory in multiculturalism, which he mentioned about. So both ways we can find out that. So, but you told in the class he totally denied the modernity, and he opposed modernity or civilization things. So how do you explain about this, controversial things? Could you explain more about that?
I just have to precede this by saying that I'm not a Gandhian scholar, right? It's Gandhi. The problem with Gandhi is that there is a whole sort of Gandhi studies methodology that seems to have emerged, especially in recent years. You look at all these numerous conferences on Gandhi and especially on Hind Swaraj. It's like a huge now a specialist area of studying those collected works of Mahatma Gandhi in the 100 volumes things. Let me, however, hazard a guess. I actually want to controversially suggest that Gandhi almost never makes an argument for the nation, and Gandhi does not speak about the Indian nation. Okay, that does not mean that he does not want the British out. In fact, as he says, he says something like, at one level, I mean, this is again the contradiction, right, in Hind Swaraj. Again, Andy might remember the text better. At one level, he says, of course, the English are not bad people. At another moment, in fact, very next page, he says a tiger will never change, or a snake, a tiger will never change its true nature. That, as long as, the British are like that, and as long as they are here, we will never be free, so they have to get out of here. They have to leave. But then he also goes on to say that once you tell them that they have to get out of here, and once they get out of here, those who stay can stay. Because they are no longer staying here under the older conditions. So it's that kind of structure. In fact, we were just having a conversation before in the break, about, I think the question was that if a British journalist had asked Gandhi during the salt tax as to who he was fighting for, what was his fight against or for, was he fighting for the Indian nation? I think, and I'm sure this can be proved because I'm sure there some British journalists must have asked him, or some journalists would have had to, there's much to be said on that subject. I think he would have said something like, I'm doing this on principle for all humanity. You know, I think that's the kind of, that's where he would be coming from, broadly speaking, on this kind of thing. So it's a symbolic gesture against the idea of oppression rather than a gesture targeted against, although of course it's a particular tax against a particular oppressor, and he will, it's a very political act as it were, but it has this larger civilizational dimension to it, and Gandhi will always speak about civilization rather than nation. Tagore, of course, on the other hand, is precisely speaking about that. Tagore is, of course, doing precisely the opposite. He is speaking about the nation. So this is my hunch.
Well, looks like it was like a reminder. Technology. So I wonder if there's one last burning question. If not, maybe we'll go into the breakout session and we can come back to more. So should we say 1:30-ish? 1:40 left? Yeah. It's okay, so should we come back at 4:30? So if possible, all these people who are in different groups can. Yeah. So I think the instruction is fairly clear this way. You have the 6 questions in your hand. You can discuss them as much as you want, or you can devise your own question. Simply come back to tell us what you have sort of thought about. Some of the key questions that we have posed in relation to Gore or specifically Gandhi. And then we'll hear the group presentation. So each group will have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, and I think Panchik set the rule yesterday.
There's one that is also about between Indians and discussion.
Is that? Yeah. Okay. So is that agreed on for everyone? I mean, one question. Can you repeat that? Okay. So can you tell me which session's gonna?
One of the questions.
So should we first say 1 to 6 and 2 to 8? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.